I was born in 1952, 4 years after the Nakba, to a Christian family and in Jerusalem. Three of my grandparents are from Gaza. Palestinian Christians from Gaza. They worshipped at the Church of St. Porphyrius, which is considered the third oldest church in the world. Right? I grew up in Jerusalem until the age of 27. I immigrated to the United States in 1977. So I was 27 when I left Palestine to come to the U.S. Siblings were already here, three of them. And I was the last of the siblings to come here. And then my parents followed 2 years after because things were getting really worse, very bad, progressively worse in Palestine. The rest of Palestine was occupied in 1967. Israel was created in 1948, but part of Palestine remained with Jordan. And that was taken over in 1967.
After the Six-Day War.
Yes. So we came under Israeli military rule in 1967, and opportunities were terrible. I mean, unemployment opportunity. I had a degree in political science. So what's a Palestinian going to be doing with a degree in political science in under Israeli rule? So I became an English teacher. But I wanted to finish my education, to do graduate studies in economics. And actually I was planning to go back and teach at a university in Palestine, but things kept getting worse. And so I decided to stay here. I was arrested in 1976 and beaten up, and I was under administrative detention.
This is in Israel, you mean?
Yes, Israel. I was arrested and thrown in an Israeli prison. Until the advent of Nazism, the immigration to Palestine was pretty low. With the coming of the Nazis, the immigration really took off to Palestine. Now, something really, really important is that, to your point about the need for safety, which is absolutely true, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism, not only in Hitler's Germany, but all over the West. And so the Jews really rightfully felt threatened and rightfully felt that they needed, better protection. But many did not see the answer as going to start a new country somewhere else. They wanted to fight with progressive forces for better human rights protections. Okay, so most, before the rise of Hitler, wanted to go to the U.S. The U.S. was opening its arms and to immigrants from all over the world. They needed the manpower. And the Zionists lobbied strongly, very, very strongly, to close the door of immigration to the United States and to other countries, Argentina, many countries in Latin America, which were destinations for European Jews to go to escape anti-Semitism.
Why did they do that?
They did that because they, basically wanted to close the doors for any option other than going to Palestine. Right from the very beginning, the Zionist leaders were saying that there can't be a Jewish state without major displacement of the Palestinians. Herzl was one of those people who said, Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, was clear about the need to get rid of the majority of the Palestinians and displace them. But in order to understand 48, it's important to also understand 1936, when the Palestinians had a major uprising against the British. as a colonial power. I mean, there were uprisings against the British all over their colonies, including Palestine. And the Jewish forces, the Zionist Jewish forces, were aligned with the British. And in 1936, Britain dealt an incredibly heavy blow to Palestinian armed resistance. And that had a big impact later in 48. The Palestinians were extremely weak, and Israel was far more. The Jewish forces, there was no Israel at the time, were much more powerful and were able to deal with, the Palestinian armed resistance very effectively. The British played the major role, but also the Americans were beginning to help. America was a little more complicated because the State Department was really not very keen on Zionism. On the other hand, the White House, was feeling a great deal of pressure from wealthy Americans who were beginning to buy the whole Zionist plan. By the way, in America, the Jewish population in general was not all Zionist. Many did not believe that there is a reason to have a Jewish state because they were fairly comfortable here. And they were afraid of being viewed as a kind of, how do you call it, a fifth column. And there was a lot of support for the Zionist military establishment from Jews who were in the U.S. military. For example, a guy by the name of Al Schwimmer really was the founder of the Israeli, what became the Israeli Air Force. So you had, people with tremendous military background and experience and connections in Western countries, rooting for the Zionists and providing them with arms and actually involved in the fight that took place from November 47 to May 48. So the Jewish forces at the time, the biggest group was called the Haganah, and they later became the backbone of the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. We call them the Israeli Offense Forces, of course. But there were also other groups like a group led by Ben-Gurion, who became Prime Minister of Israel, called the Irgun, and another group called Lehi, which were really, Begin's group and Lehi were really, really serious terrorists who were impatient for the establishment of the Jewish state. So they were even fighting the British, to accelerate the formation of the Jewish state. Because the British were going too slow for, and in fact, even the Haganah, which was kind of more respectable military Jewish force. Even the Haganah was, on the outside they pretended to dissociate themselves from these terrorists, but in fact there was very strong cooperation between the Haganah and these so-called, but they really all did very terrorist actions against the British. It kind of gets complicated because the British at some point started, maybe because of influence of some Arab leaders, maybe with petroleum interests, to put some pressure. And there was a little bit more kind of consciousness about international law. So the Brits at one point started putting limits on Jewish immigration because they didn't want the whole thing to blow up, in Palestine. And that's when some of these Jewish organizations started becoming,
terrorist groups.
Right. Begin was responsible for the blowing up of the King David Hotel, which at the time was the headquarters for the British Mandate in Palestine. Palestine was under the British mandate, and the headquarters were at the King David Hotel. And Begin blew up, was part of a terrorist group that blew up a huge part of the King David Hotel. Many Brits were killed, some Arabs were killed, and 17 Jews were killed. But until the very end, there were interests in Britain, Churchill among them, who saw a Jewish state as a big asset in their colonial, perception of scheme of things. That this is going to be an ally in the heart of a very strategic area that's going to be a very big asset to the British government. So that trumped everything. That trumped the fact that there were British subjects and British government employees being blown up, and British policemen and soldiers being blown up in Palestine by Jewish terrorists. And all of them committed real grave crimes against the Palestinians. Now, the transfer option means that, you can't have a Jewish state without a majority of Jewish population. So there has to be displacement of Palestinians. So the idea was to have some, fireworks. The fireworks were in the form of massacres. Under the excuse of armed conflict, the villages and towns that had Palestinian fighters who were fighting the takeover of their land, there were massacres all over Palestine. And the massacres were done strategically in a particular geographic, it was very well studied, like we do something here to evacuate this area. In the area of Jerusalem, the biggest massacre was Deir Yassin massacre. Deir Yassin got a great deal of coverage in the international media. Western journalists were there and covered it and covered the details. Begin, Menachem Begin, who later became prime minister and who was the terrorist leader of the Deir Yassin massacre, boasted in his autobiography later that after Deir Yassin, the Jewish forces were able to go through Palestine like a knife through butter. But it wasn't the only one, and it certainly wasn't the largest one. One of the largest ones was the massacre of Lid, which is known now as Lod, L-O-D, where the airport is. I don't know the exact figures, but about 300 people were killed. But there were many, many others. Duwaima, near Hebron, and in the north, there have been, documentaries actually done by some Israeli filmmakers about massacres of Palestinian villages. And after that, indeed, the majority of Palestinians took fright.
And so the State of Israel was created in 1948.
That's right.
And what role did the United Nations play in those days towards seeing the creation of...
See, the United Nations voted, a majority of the United Nations Security General Assembly voted in favor of the creation of the State of Israel. But a lot of that was under severe pressure from the US and England. There were a number of countries that were going to vote against, but were pressured by the Americans and the Brits to vote in favor. And so there was that partition. But like I said, the United Nations assigned 57% of the territory, and the Jewish forces ended up taking a lot more. It took over 78% of the land.
So basically that is the beginning of what is resulted in the last 16 months or so with Gaza and the West Bank and southern Lebanon.
Yes, I mean, we Palestinians say that the catastrophe never really ended, It took different forms, The forms that it took well after 48, into the early 50s, the now Jewish state, now there was Israel, a Jewish state, continued ethnically cleansing some villages, expelling people, forcing them at the point of a gun into buses and throwing them across the border to Jordan or Lebanon or Syria. So there was a lot of ethnic cleansing even, into the early 50s. After that, the direct ethnic cleansing stopped. But there was an institution of an apartheid system, a system of total inequality vis-a-vis the remaining the remaining small percentage of Palestinians who remained within what became the Jewish state, only 15%. After 48, at the year 48, at the creation of the State of Israel that year, the population was 15% Palestinian Arabs who remained. The rest had fled. There was curfew on their villages and towns and neighborhoods all the way till 1965.
Really?
Yes. So curfew from sunset to sunrise. And not only that, but there were situations like in the 1956 war, the tripartite aggression against Egypt, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. And that gives you an example of how Israel became a watchdog for imperial powers. When Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal, Israel attacked and took over Sinai with British and French help. The Suez Canal was run by the British and the French.
Sinai was in which country?
Egypt.
So they were the attack dogs for the British, basically.
Absolutely. They went in, took over Gaza. Gaza Strip was one of the pieces that had not fallen to the Jewish forces in 1948. It was under Egyptian rule. They overran Gaza and they overran the rest of Egyptian territory up to the Suez Canal, all of Sinai. Okay.
Wow.
And it was Eisenhower at the time who really forced them to get out of the Sinai. Now, it looked like a very magnanimous act on the side of the Americans, and to some extent it was. But, the U.S. was the rising imperial power, and they wanted to, deal a blow to the old colonial powers, France and England. So they forced their ally, Israel, to get out of the Sinai.
Yeah, but Israel had Gaza still.
In 1956. They took it over for a short while with the rest of, with Sinai. With the Sinai.
Did they give Gaza back in the end? Were obliged to do that?
So when Eisenhower put his foot down and forced Israel, it was against international law, and back then there was some semblance of acceptance of, compliance with international law.
In those days, no longer today.
No longer today, exactly. Eisenhower did other things, actually, that were... all American administrations have been very supportive of Israel, but they really checked Israel when it went way overboard. So they did that when they took over the Sinai, and they also did it when Israel tried to divert the waters of the Yarmouk River, which is entirely in the territory of Syria and Jordan. When Israel tried to divert the waters of the Yarmouk to Israel, Eisenhower stepped in and told them, no, you can't do this. Reagan was extremely pro-Israeli, and his administration, was as guilty as any of supporting the most, hawkish positions of Israel. But in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, and the media was far less controlled by Israeli propaganda machines. And the Washington Post and, Christian Science Monitor back then was a very big player. The major media outlets were talking about the horrors, the massacres that Israel was committing in 1982. And American public opinion was very, very strongly moved. Even mainstream American Jews were saying, not in our name. And Reagan telephoned Begin, says, you get out of Lebanon right now, and Begin did, But contrast this to Biden today. Biden basically, kept feeding the monster with more and more weapons of genocide. This is really at the heart of the so-called conflict. At the heart of the problem is that Israel never, and the Zionists never, before the creation of Israel, the Zionists before the creation of Israel and Israeli leaders after the creation of Israel never saw themselves as part of the neighborhood, as a Levantine, part of the Middle East. They saw themselves as a primarily European, civilized European Western, presence in that region. And they sold the idea that, look, rely on us to help you against, like, for example, Jamal Abdel Nasser, when he nationalized the Suez Canal. They immediately struck. And likewise, in 1967, that was the height of Arab nationalism. The whole Arab world was talking about, we need to be truly independent of the colonial powers, to take control of our oil resources, to, especially the oil resources. Now, that's a resource that the U.S. considered as its own oil.
Yes.
And who were the guardians of the interests of the U.S., but Saudi Arabia and the sheikdoms of the Gulf, and other royal regimes in the Middle East. And who were the biggest enemies? Syria and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Iraq, etc. So the 1967 defeat by Israel of the regimes of Nasser and Syria was viewed as an enormous victory for the U.S. And that is when really the U.S. started saying, this is a very reliable ally, effectively, maybe not directly, they are protecting our allies like the Saudis and the sheikdoms. Because whenever there is a rise in Arab nationalists, mass movements, Israel can be relied on to do something, to
protect our interests.
Yes. And so this old colonial mentality is really still at play. And by the way, this role that Israel has played has not been only in the Middle East. It has also been very important in South Africa. It has been important in Latin America. So, behind all of this is the continuing Nakba that I mentioned, the continuing catastrophe, meaning the land confiscation, the expansion of settlements, the dispossession of Palestinians, the, arrests, complete arrests for any kind of, resistance, no matter how peaceful. I mean, Palestinian nonviolent resistance has been there all along. You never hear about it in the Western media. The labor unions, the doctors' unions, all the professional organizations, and the schools, and etc. But there was no tolerance whatsoever for any kind of,
dialogue or genuine negotiation. No.
A relative of mine by the name of Ilham Farah was one of the tiny Palestinian community that has remained in Gaza. And that entire community has, almost all of them, only about 1,000 people, have been sheltering in 3 churches. But especially in the 2 largest churches, the Church of St. Porphyrius and the Church of the Holy Family. Porphyrius is Orthodox, Holy Family is Catholic. So she happened to be sheltering at St. Porphyrius. That has a compound. So not just the church building, but also, associated buildings, administrative.
They're all sleeping in these churches, are they?
Yes.
Eating there? And
absolutely, everything.
It's the only place they could go that was safe.
Right. Safe. Because St. Porphyrius, the compound, was bombed very early on, and 18 Palestinian Christians were killed in that bombing. The church was damaged, but remained mostly intact. Ilham, 84-year-old woman, Ilham Farah, a music teacher who taught many generations of Gazans, several generations of Gazans music, very well known and beloved in the community. She was spooked, so she moved to the Church of the Holy Family, the Catholic Church. After about a month, she wanted a change of clothes and to check on her house. So she wanted to go to her house. Everybody says, don't do it, it's dangerous. She didn't listen. While she was walking the last, small distance to her house, indeed, an Israeli sniper shot her in the leg.
She's obviously a woman.
84-year-old woman. And when a sniper shoots you, they know, who they're shooting. And she's petite, very coquette woman, loves pinks, and, clearly a woman. Yeah. And so she was on her cell phone trying to get help, but anybody who tried to come and get her was shot at. So she bled and bled. And we later learned that an Israeli tank went over her the next morning. We don't know whether she was still alive or not. So that's the story of Ilham Farah, 84-year-old woman. The killing from bombs and snipers, etc., is not the whole story. And here's a case in point. Another relative of mine, sheltering in the Church of the Holy Family, she died in the arms of her son, a doctor, who could not save her. He could have easily saved her with the medicine that was prescribed to her. But because of the siege, Israeli leaders have very, very explicitly articulated their objectives. No medicine, no fuel, no food, and no water. These were the words of Gallant,